At least change your clothes before anyone else sees you, you look homeless, and I can't be seen with someone who couldn't bother to dress properly for our own grandmother's funeral, my sister Victoria hissed as she pulled me aside in the funeral home hallway, her designer black dress perfectly pressed, her jewelry carefully selected, her contempt barely concealed beneath a veneer of sisterly concern. This is exactly why Mom says you'll never amount to anything. You can't even pretend to be presentable for one day. I looked down at my vintage coat, the oversized trousers, the boots I'd worn for a decade, clothes that told stories Victoria had never bothered to read, and I quietly moved to the back of the chapel where my presence wouldn't embarrass my family. But why did I smile instead of cry, and why, 4 months later at the most exclusive Fashion Week party of the season, did Victoria's champagne glass shatter on the marble floor when the editor-in-chief of Vogue walked past her extended hand and embraced me instead? Elena, your fall collection changed everything we thought we knew about sustainable fashion. We want you on the September cover. The words carried across the crowded room. Victoria stood frozen, her hand still extended toward an editor who had just walked through her as if she were invisible. I'm sorry, Victoria managed, her voice cracking. Did you say the September cover? Margaret Chen, the most powerful woman in fashion publishing, turned to look at my sister with polite confusion. I'm sorry, have we met? I'm Victoria Morrison, Elena's sister. Ah. Margaret's expression revealed nothing. Elena has never mentioned a sister. The silence that followed was everything I'd never allowed myself to imagine. The homeless aesthetic Victoria had mocked at our grandmother's funeral was, in fact, deliberate. I'd spent 15 years developing a design philosophy that rejected the disposable glamour my sister worshipped. My clothes were built to last, vintage fabrics reconstructed, sustainable materials engineered for decades of use, silhouettes that transcended seasonal trends. The coat I'd worn to the funeral had been my first major piece, designed during graduate school, constructed from reclaimed military canvas, worn continuously for 8 years. It had become my signature, appearing in fashion magazines Victoria had apparently never read. But Victoria saw only what she expected to see, her unsuccessful sister, dressed inappropriately, embarrassing the family at an important event. She'd never thought to question why galleries sent invitations addressed to me. Why packages arrived from Tokyo, Paris, Copenhagen. Why I traveled constantly but never discussed my destinations. She decided who I was decades ago and never updated her assessment. The fashion career had started almost by accident. After dropping out of the business program my parents had insisted on, I'd enrolled in textile design at a small art school they'd never heard of. The decision had caused a family rupture that had never fully healed. You're throwing away your future, my mother had said. Fashion design? That's not a real career, my father had added. I give it 6 months before she comes crawling back, Victoria had predicted. The 6 months had become 15 years. The first recognition had come from Japan. A small boutique in Tokyo had discovered my work at a student exhibition and placed an order for 12 pieces. The order had led to more orders. The boutique had led to other boutiques. Within 3 years, my designs were appearing in stores across Asia and Europe. I'd kept it quiet from my family, not out of secrecy, but because their opinions had stopped mattering. They'd made clear what they thought of my choices. I'd stopped seeking their approval. My grandmother had been the only one who'd understood. Eleanor Morrison had visited my studio once, 3 years before her death. She'd taken the train alone, at 84, without telling anyone in the family. She'd appeared at my door in Brooklyn with a suitcase and a determination that reminded me why I'd loved her. Show me everything, she'd said. I'd shown her the workshop, the fabrics, the designs in progress. I'd explained the philosophy, sustainability, longevity, the rejection of fast fashion's environmental destruction. She'd touched the vintage coat I always wore. This is what you were meant to do. I've known since you were 6 and redesigned all your doll's clothes. Mom thinks I'm wasting my life. Your mother thinks success looks like Victoria's life. She's wrong. My grandmother had squeezed my hand. Keep building. Stop hiding. And when I'm gone, don't let them make you feel small. The funeral had been 4 months ago. Victoria's words, "You look homeless," had stung more than I'd expected. Not because I valued her opinion, but because she'd said them at our grandmother's funeral. The one person who'd understood me, and Victoria couldn't pause her criticism for even that occasion. I'd stood in the back, as she'd suggested. I'd accepted the pitying glances from relatives who agreed with Victoria's assessment. I'd left early, before the reception, before anyone could express additional disappointment in how I'd chosen to honor my grandmother. What Victoria hadn't noticed, what no one in my family had noticed, was the small group at the edge of the cemetery. 3 women who'd come to pay respects to Eleanor Morrison. Women who'd met my grandmother during her visit to my studio. Women who worked for some of the most influential publications in fashion. They'd come because my grandmother had written to them after her visit, expressing pride in her granddaughter's work. "Your grandmother was remarkable," one had said as she left. "She made us promise to feature your next collection." The next collection had launched 6 weeks later. The fall line was called Eleanor, 32 pieces inspired by my grandmother's wardrobe from the 1950s, reconstructed using sustainable methods, designed to last another 70 years. The response had been overwhelming. Features in publications Victoria read religiously, though she'd apparently skipped the pages with my name on them. Orders from stores she couldn't afford to shop in. Interest from celebrities whose names she dropped constantly. And finally, the Vogue invitation. The Fashion Week party where Victoria encountered reality was hosted by a designer whose work I'd collaborated with 2 seasons earlier. I'd almost not attended. These events were exhausting, too many people performing importance, too much champagne, too little genuine connection. But Margaret Chen had specifically requested my presence. The September cover discussion needed to happen in person. I'd arrived in the same vintage coat Victoria had mocked, paired with trousers from my own collection and the boots I'd worn for a decade. I'd looked exactly like myself. Victoria had apparently spent weeks securing an invitation to this party. She worked in marketing, not fashion marketing, pharmaceutical marketing, but she decided that Fashion Week was her path to a more glamorous life. She'd networked relentlessly, called in favors, bought a dress she couldn't afford, and finally obtained entry to an event where she knew no one. Her plan, I'd later learn, was to approach editors and introduce herself as someone with unique perspectives on brand positioning. She'd prepared talking points, rehearsed her pitch, researched which attendees might be receptive to her approach. What she hadn't prepared for was seeing her sister, the one who looked homeless, being embraced by the most powerful woman in fashion. The champagne glass shattering had drawn attention throughout the room. Victoria stood surrounded by broken crystal, her carefully constructed composure collapsing. "You're a designer," she managed. "Since when are you a designer?" "Since 15 years ago. When I dropped out of business school to study textiles." "But you never said, Mom and Dad don't know." "I stopped discussing my career with people who'd decided it was worthless. You told me I'd come crawling back within 6 months. Why would I share my successes with someone who was waiting for me to fail?" Victoria's face cycled through emotions, confusion, embarrassment, something that might have been shame. "The September cover. That's the most important issue of the year." "I know. How did you? I don't understand how this happened without anyone knowing." "Everyone who matters knew. You just weren't paying attention." Margaret Chen had observed this exchange with the clinical interest of someone who'd witnessed countless family dramas in her career. "Elena, shall we find somewhere quieter to discuss the shoot?" "Of course." I turned to Victoria. "Enjoy the party. The past appetizers are excellent." I walked away without looking back. The conversation with Margaret covered logistics, shoot dates, creative direction, the story angle they wanted to pursue. "The sustainability narrative is powerful," she explained. "Your grandmother's influence on your aesthetic. The rejection of fast fashion. The longevity philosophy. You want to include my grandmother in the piece? If you're comfortable." The letter she wrote us was remarkable. A woman in her 80s, advocating for her granddaughter's work with such passion and specificity. Margaret smiled. She knew exactly what you'd built, even if others didn't. The tears I'd suppressed at the funeral finally emerged. She was the only one who understood. "Then we'll make sure everyone understands now." The party continued around us, but I was aware of Victoria's presence across the room. She'd cleaned up the broken glass with help from a server. She'd attempted to resume her networking campaign. But the energy had shifted. People had witnessed her interaction with me, had seen the editor-in-chief walk past her, had understood that whatever connection she claimed to the fashion world was fictional. She left early. I stayed until Margaret had everything she needed for the shoot. The family response to the Vogue announcement was complicated. My mother called 3 days after the party. Apparently Victoria had reported what she'd witnessed, and the news had finally penetrated. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years, and you never mentioned you were successful? Would you have believed me?" "Of course we would have. You told me fashion design wasn't a real career. Dad said I was throwing away my future. Victoria predicted I'd fail within 6 months. We were concerned about your choices. You were dismissive of my choices. There's a difference." The conversation that followed covered ground we'd avoided for 15 years. My mother's fear that I'd struggle financially. My father's disappointment that I'd rejected his guidance. Victoria's resentment that I'd escaped the conventional path she dutifully followed. "She's been crying for 3 days," my mother said about Victoria. "She feels terrible about what she said at the funeral." "She should feel terrible. She told me I looked homeless at our grandmother's funeral. She didn't know. She didn't ask. She decided I was a failure and treated me accordingly. The fact that she was wrong doesn't erase how she behaved." "Can you forgive her?" I can acknowledge that she behaved badly. Forgiveness requires accountability, and Victoria has never been accountable for how she's treated me. The September issue shoot happened 6 weeks later. The feature was extensive, 12 pages of my designs, photographed on models who understood the sustainability philosophy, accompanied by text that explained the Eleanor collection's origins. My grandmother's letter was reprinted in full. My granddaughter has built something extraordinary while her family failed to notice. I hope you'll give her work the attention it deserves, because I won't be here to advocate for her much longer. Reading those words in Vogue, the magazine Victoria had left on every coffee table for years, was the closure I hadn't known I needed. Victoria requested a meeting after the issue was published. We met at a cafe near my studio, neutral territory, public enough to prevent the conversation from becoming too intense. She arrived carrying the September issue. I've read it 3 times, she said. The whole feature. The letter from grandmother. And I've been a terrible sister. For years. Maybe always. The acknowledgement was more direct than I'd expected. What made you realize that? The Vogue cover, or the way you treated me before you knew I had won? Victoria flinched. Both. But honestly? The party. Watching Margaretchen walk past me to hug you. Realizing that the sister I dismissed had achieved something I couldn't even approach. She paused. I was so convinced you'd failed that I never looked for evidence that you'd succeeded. You never asked about my life. Not once in 15 years. I know. I was afraid of what it might mean if you were happy without following the path I'd followed. The conversation continued for 2 hours. Victoria explained things I'd never understood, her own insecurities, her fear that my different choices represented a criticism of her conventional ones, her need to see me fail to validate her own sacrifices. I went to business school because Dad wanted me to. I took the corporate job because it was safe. I married someone suitable because that's what you do. Her voice cracked. And then you just left. Did what you wanted. Built something beautiful. You could have built something too. Not now. I'm 43 with a mortgage and a child and a career I can't walk away from. Then build something within those constraints. But stop resenting me for building something within mine. The reconciliation was gradual and incomplete. Victoria had spent too many years practicing contempt to fully abandon it. I had spent too many years protecting myself from her judgment to fully trust her transformation. But something had shifted. She asked questions now. Real questions about my work, my process, my plans. She read the features about my collections. She told her daughter about her aunt the designer. She never again commented on my clothes. The following September, my second Vogue cover was published. This time, the feature included a photograph I'd kept private for years, my grandmother in my studio, touching the vintage coat she'd loved, her face lit with pride. Victoria called after seeing it. She visited you. I didn't know that. No one knew. She wanted it to be ours. She saw everything you built. Yes. I'm glad. I'm glad someone in the family understood. It was, perhaps, the most generous thing Victoria had ever said to me. The funeral outfit remained in my wardrobe. The coat, the trousers, the boots Victoria had mocked as homeless attire, I wore them still. They appeared in interviews, on red carpets, in photographs that documented my public life. They were my signature. My grandmother had understood why. Some clothes tell stories. Mine told the story of a woman who built something while her family wasn't watching. Who honored her grandmother's memory in fabric and thread. Who dressed exactly as she meant to, regardless of what her sister thought she should look like. She called me homeless at our grandmother's funeral. Told me I was an embarrassment. Made me stand in the back where no one would have to see my vintage coat and worn boots. 4 months later, at the most exclusive fashion week party of the year, the editor-in-chief of Vogue walked past my sister's outstretched hand and embraced me instead. Your fall collection changed everything. We want you for the September cover. My sister's champagne glass shattered on the floor. 15 years I'd been building a fashion empire while my family dismissed me as a failure. My grandmother had been the only one who'd visited my studio, written letters to editors, believed in what I was creating. The September cover feature included her words, "My granddaughter has built something extraordinary while her family failed to notice." Victoria finally noticed. Too late to matter, but not too late to change. I still wear the coat she mocked. It tells the story of who I am, the story she never bothered to read.